40K is a great game in an interesting setting with all sorts of fun factions for everyone to play. But it's a bit troubled. If Reddit's to be believed, it's the fault of the Space Chads, and if GW is to stop making things for them and just only make Eldar, Tau, and Chaos models, the game would be in perfect harmony. And doing this would finally awaken Aang from his 100-year slumber, and he would come back and bring balance to the 4 Xenos factions, and no one would ever play Space Marines again because they're bad, and you should feel bad for playing them. But game design isn't quite that simple. In fact, historically speaking, game design for 40K has been kind of all over the place, so real who's of who's shit. But we're not looking at that right now. In fact, if you want to really look at a widespread history of 40K, I would say factions that people complain are getting ignored right now have been one of the historically stronger factions to play, and Space Marines were a little weaker.
Fucking Riptide.
But I want to tackle the harder question. How can we fix 40K from a fundamental game design point? And before people start sending me hate mail saying that I am a Space Marine fanboy and sending me terribly Photoshop pictures of me making sweet, sweet love to Matt Ward, this isn't a defense of the Space Marines. I feel kind of dirty even having to come in here and preempt my entire argument with, I mean, I don't support them. I'm just here to make a point. No, it's Primaris are busted. The key to fixing the game is looking for what GW finds as the core gameplay loop. What they think is the most important thing when playing Warhammer 40,000. In video games, it's a little easier to find. You do the tutorial, you play the first couple missions, and generally a developer will highlight or focus or sometimes even force you to do what they consider the core gameplay loop, to introduce it to you, so you know what it is going forward. But 40K doesn't function that way. In fact, GW just kind of hands you a fat notebook and a codex and say, good luck, figure it out. So to delve into the deep, depraved mind of GW's lead development team, we're going to have to look at their other game, the red-headed stepchild, Blood Bowl. Who am I kidding? Nobody plays Blood Bowl anymore. Age of Sigmar is a pretty interesting character study into what GW think makes a fun game. Well, GW sort of had a fantasy game actually before Age of Sigmar, which they may or may not have given the EA experience and dragged behind a shed and shot. But that's not the point we're making here. In fact, I think it makes it a much better case study to what GW cares about in a game. And it leads us to our first big example of game design. In Age of Sigmar, everything is the same. GW normalized many unit types and various monsters into kind of the same class, I would describe. If you were to look at it in terms of 40K, they removed toughness just across the board. That doesn't matter. Everything wounds everything. Everything is identical. This means that a guy in a t-shirt and a main battle tank are going to take the same amount of damage from me throwing a rock at them. This lends itself to finding the same result from firing your 5.56 into an Abrams battle tank as you would firing into a small crowd of bunnies you have in your backyard. Both result in 1 wound done on a 3-up. Now, to those of you unfamiliar with how tabletop gaming works, especially in the 40K scene, the entire game is designed around a D6 system, meaning that every result from every weapon is pretty much encompassed by one of 6 results. Which, when you say out loud, almost sounds insane, but we're not getting to that quite yet. And Age of Sigmar has taken this to the extreme. Every weapon from every person has a set hit chance and a set wounding mechanic, meaning that no matter what you're slinging it at, you're going to hit on a 3 and you're going to wound on a 3. Which led GW to making durability tied to armor saves and various other weird mechanics, like if you attack me on a Tuesday, then you get -1 to wound, but also simultaneously I get +1 armor, which adds up to a Thursday bonus of Taco Tuesday. But that doesn't necessarily uncomplicate the game. In fact, I would argue that's more confusing for a new user experience. At least in the old system, something could have a high toughness, and you'd be able to math out, well, at least I know what to expect from my low toughness weaponry. Now you gotta teach everybody that your weapon has a set chance to wound unless it's targeting this, which every different unit sometimes has a way of interacting with wounding, and then various faction effects and everything else. It gets messy quick. But that's digressing away from the core issue at hand. When you generalize weapon strength and weapon a chance to hit it takes away a lot of the unique flavor from a faction. Let's take a look at what I consider the chief offender of this factor. This fine gentleman right here is Archon, the ever-chosen champion of chaos, the three-eyed king, lord of the end times, Kingslayer, and various other bullshit titles that you'd find attached to him. And now I don't say bullshit because they're all made up or he doesn't deserve them. He truly is a one-man wrecking crew of destruction and violence. Instead, you'll find that just none of the titles really matter. Archon the Ever-Chosen can't defend himself from some of the weakest units in the game. For example, I'm going to go ahead and just take clan rats. Tiny little shit rats that have tiny spears and rusty knives they use to, I don't know, scalp bananas. Really? Scalp bananas is the best you got? Clan rats have a 4-up chance to hit and a 4-up chance to wound, which means at either stage of hitting and wounding, they have a 50-50 shot of actually doing it, averaging out to 25% chance to deal damage to their target. But they cost different points, that's why they do different things. Yep, I'm not there yet. I have not even encompassed this fucking mess. So when you compare point costs from the War Scroll builder they have on their own website, you get one Archon for 800 points, which for the uninitiated is almost half your army. For the same point cost, you can get 160 clan rats. Now, why does Archon cost this many points, you ask? And why can you get so many clan rats for the cost of one character? Well, Archon comes with his own smorgasbord of special abilities and rules that generally add out to making him harder to kill. This sounds like such a good idea on paper until you realize this is just a stopgap fix for him having no other stats other than how many wounds he has and what his armor save is. When you consider the fact that these clan rat squads at 40 guys a squad will do an average of 10 wounds to him every turn. Of course, I'm speaking in a vacuum here. There's no way you can get 40 clan rats around Archon. And he only has a 3-up save on top of this. There's not really that much he can do to defend himself from just a horde of mindless clan rats. In fact, why would you take Archon when you can take so much cheap fodder? The old Russian tactic stands true. You can easily overwhelm an enemy of any elite status by just drowning them in bodies, which from a real-world application seems fair. 2-on-1 fights are nigh impossible. I don't care how awesome you are. But this is a game, and you're kind of looking at superhumans versus 4-foot-tall extra chromosome rats. So GW's fix to this? We'll just tack on 16 special rules that modify how likely he is to get hit or take damage. Which would be a smart fix, except for the fact that there is no way of discerning what kind of weapon type is hitting him. The result of a clan rat and the result of a dwarven cannon, or even giant demigod angels hitting you in the face with holy blades, is the same. So they have to be extra careful to make sure their modify this result doesn't suddenly make assault rifles or cannons do less damage to Archon. The irony here is they already had a much better version of doing this. Toughness values and strength. In fact, it was in their game for years before they got rid of it. Now, I'm not about to start justifying toughness and strength as like a very realistic way of dealing damage. Generalizing all weapons into one of like 10 results on a strength meter also doesn't really represent the differences between muzzle velocity of gunpowder weapons and penetration power and yada 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 yada. The point I'm getting at is that when you have a system based on 10 results of strength versus 10 results of toughness, you can actually represent various types of weaponry hitting various toughnesses pretty easily. The odds of this small Skaven boy actually stabbing a fragile elf versus a thick Chad dwarf are very different. Just like his odds of actually hurting a Chaos Warrior and then getting through his ridiculous plate mail, even worse than hurting the fragile elf. And generally, GW said they changed this because, well, it was too complicated for new players. Which, at the start, they kinda had a point. Everyone wounded on this and everyone hit on this. It simplified it very easily. You didn't really have to worry about many things affecting your output and input for your units. That being said, it's much different now. Most units and factions have ways of modifying their dice and their hit rolls. It's almost like GW knows that they need to add some sort of complexity to their game if they really want people to play it in any serious fashion without most things just being homogenous and the same. Which after, holy shit, this is a long video, brings us all the way back to 40k. 40k doesn't even use this system, which really leads me to believe that GW doesn't know what they're doing with unit design. 40k still uses the toughness versus strength system from old fantasy, but they generalized it a little bit. It's pretty hard to modify yourself outside of anywhere between 3 to 5's the wound. Unless you're double the toughness of the strength, which isn't likely for most weapon systems, you're gonna be wounding on at least 5's. 6's the wound and 2's the wound, respectively, are pretty hard to find, which generalizes the game still. You look at these weapon types and you're like saying, okay, so my boy has a big gun and your boy has a big gun, but you can still shoot at things you probably shouldn't be shooting at. It'd be as if 40k was set on a modern battlefield, where one guy could show up with nothing but tanks, and one guy could show up with nothing but infantry with M4s. You would think that one side couldn't hurt the other, but you would still deal damage. There's no way to really wound yourself out, or get yourself into a position where you can't hurt the enemy, which GW has decided was a bad design. They even went out on multiple posts saying, hey, we want everything to hurt everything. Which sounds like a great idea on paper until you realize that a lot of your player base is just going to then find the best generalist weapon, which is exactly what you saw from a competitive design for all of 8th edition. Most good competitive units used autocannons or some equivalent, Dark Reapers, whatever. Anything that was medium strength, medium penetration, medium damage, because it's going to perform against almost everything pretty well. Most of the generalist anti-tank weapons can't kill infantry because it's only got like one shot. Most of the anti-horde weapons can't hurt most tanks because, like, yeah, you can wound it on 6's, but you don't get a lot of penetration or a lot of damage, and it's going to take forever. So instead, they found a mid-ground unit, which then just became the best possible option. But that wasn't how it always was. Their game has kind of received some bloat over the years. A decade ago, in the halcyon days of the 2010s, the game looked very different. Some of the largest units on the field were Terminators, and Land Raiders, and Tau Crisis suits. If you were lucky, you had some guy with more money than Grey Matter and decided he wanted to play Imperial Guard, and he would throw some Lehman Russes at you, and that was bonkers. You'd be like, oh god, is that a Lehman Russ? Look at the armor on that thing. How do I kill that? But GW wants to move product, and the best way to do that is to introduce new units and new unit types so people will buy them because their army won't have equivalents. The first big offender of this is the Riptide. Really the largest unit of the time. Before the Riptide, you had like a Wraith Lord or a Dreadnought, maybe a Phoenix Lord or whatever. They would show up. The Avatar of Cain. A lot of Eldar stuff now that I think about it. And this thing was a monster. Huge, hard to kill, expensive, and absolutely deadly on the battlefield. This thing could target units as they deployed from Deep Strike, reducing entire 10-man Terminator squads to small piles of goo on your own turn. All of this to justify buying it. It was an expensive model with a high point cost, and to get people to use it, you had to make it deadly. It's the same game design philosophy that you see in many popular video games. World of Warcraft especially believes that most players won't want to do something unless they're seeing big numbers. They want to see impact. No one's really playing for the slow game or for like a unique effect. You see a lot of this bleed into, say, other game types like D&D. As a cooperative tabletop game, you think people would be more into support roles or less grandstanding. But it still happens. A lot of min-maxers will show up with characters that can just one-shot everything because that's fun for them. But that works in a D&D setting. D&D is completely cooperative. The second you make something like 40k, where the game is adversarial, you're against another person. When you make a unit that can target almost anything on the battlefield and reduce it to goo, why use anything else? You bring yourself to the point where you have to justify taking weaker units just so it's harder for yourself. And from a competitive standpoint, who's actively going to gimp themselves? People who want to win will use the best option. And so it went from there. And this would carry on with GW's game design. Every edition would introduce some new unit type or mechanic that would become the theme of the edition, essentially. 6th edition's big thing was flying units, and it became such an oppressive unit type that every faction with it pretty much used it en masse. There was no reason to field anything that didn't fly. For those who didn't know, the original version of a flying unit could only be hit on a 6 unless it was an anti-air gun. That's beside the fact that some factions didn't even get effective anti-air weaponry besides their own flyers. Case in point, Tyranids. This army is thematically and designed to be a swarm army or a monster army. You can get big stompy monsters or mix and match with the tiny swarms you have available to you. Essentially one big ground game of cool monstrosities. But they also had access to a flying tyrant, which is like their regular Tyrant, but flying, so you only hit them on 6s. Now, if you were selecting a Hive Tyrant and you're like, man, I want him to not die, would you think you'd pick the regular Tyrant or the one that got hit on 6s? Seems like a difficult choice, doesn't it? They came out with the Wraith Knight for the Eldar, which is a lot like a Wraith Lord, except big and probably did steroids and bullied other Wraith units in high school. And after beating us down with all these Xenos monstrosities, they decided that the Imperium should have this as well. So they came out with Night Titans. I mean Imperial Knights, which aren't Titans. They're smaller and fit on a regular game board because you weren't allowed to have super heavies back then. Which is really just systemic from everyone buying all these really good giant Titans and running them as Xenos, and then GW saying, well, how are we supposed to balance this for the Imperiums who are mad that they don't get these giant monstrosities? But that's not balance. That's an arms race. When everyone just keeps getting bigger things that shoot at bigger things and then they need more damage to deal with it to make it valuable because if it doesn't do damage, well, what's the point of taking a giant monstrosity? Durability doesn't have a cost. I mean, don't get me wrong, you will play the points for having that 3-up armor save, but most people will blow right through it. Just ask the Eldar. No one's ever been baffled by the armor save of a Dark Reaper or a Fire Dragon. The more damage they add to the game, the less durability matters. And the less durability matters, the more you need to do damage to compensate for that. And here's where we get to the vicious cycle. And nowhere is this more self-evident than the Primaris Marines. In itself, the Primaris Marines aren't the most insulting thing on the planet. They decided that, this is the flagship product for all of 40k. It's a faction that most people enjoy, and even I got myself into 40k due to Space Marines. To this day, I still remember the Dawn of War 2 intro, and thinking to myself, that's pretty badass. If they want to do true scale, fine. If they want to give them more wounds, more power to them. Space Marines need to be durable. In fact, from their lore, they're incredibly durable. But why should they do more damage for that concept? When first pitched, a Primaris Marine was an alternative to Space Marines, and were very specific and didn't do every job. But boy, did that change quickly. And as they release more Primaris units, you find that they have direct comparisons to other Space Marine units. And across the board, they are, I would say, better in every way. When you compare an Intercessor to a Tactical Marine, you look at what you get for what you're paying for. An Intercessor is a few more points than a Tactical Marine for a unit that is more durable, has more melee capability, a better gun with more range, and more penetrative power. And the selling point for still using Tactical Marines is that they have access to special weapons that the Tacticals have been slowly getting melee-wise, at least on their Sergeants every couple of months. But assuming they don't double back on that decision, you have to look at the base kit versus the base kit. The base kit of a Tactical Marine is a bolt gun. The bolt gun is an iconic weapon that's been in the game for years. However, nowadays, it's not much better than a lasgun. It has one more strength in it, making it slightly better at shooting higher toughness things. But when you look at the Intercessor's Chad bolt gun, that thing has penetrative power. A lot of penetrative power. Which, as we discussed earlier, makes it able to kind of really mess with almost everything on the field. So why would you need to pay points to specialize your Tactical Marines when you have a unit that is generally better and just performs a better job? If you look at their new releases, they're coming in the 9th edition and saying, hey, we're going to replace the Predator tank with a new Primaris variant. They even make direct comparisons to it. And you look at the weapon systems of a Predator tank versus this new Primaris tank. The bog standard Predator tank is the Predator Destructor, or whatever they call it in the lore. I'm pretty sure it's Destructor. Whatever, don't sue me. It's got a menacing autocannon that devastates infantry and 2 heavy bolters, which are the heaviest machine guns available to the Space Marines. That main autocannon deals a random amount of shots, and on maximum fires 6 times. Its heavy bolters will fire 6 times as well, but without the randomness. So hey, that's kind of nice. That autocannon, it's strength 8, so hey, that's going to hurt most things actually, even vehicles. It's got a moderate amount of penetration, so it can hurt most armored units, and deals 3 flat damage, which is actually fantastic. Its heavy bolters are strength 5, so slightly above the standard infantry units of most factions, and it's pen 1, so it can do a little bit of damage to armor. Not bad, I'd say, actually a pretty quality unit. Let's compare that to the new Primaris version, which, for sake of argument, we'll look at their anti-infantry variant. We don't have all the information on it, so we're just going to compare the main gun to the main gun. The main gun of the anti-infantry variant is 2 Onslaught Gatling cannons, which we have the stats for. In fact, one of them is the primary weapon to a Redemptor Dreadnought. Just one. That thing is going to fire 24 Strength 5 AP -1 shots. And for those of you paying attention, that makes that thing the combined armament of the twin heavy bolters of the Predator tank ×4. And that's without knowing what the side weapons on the new Primaris tank are. I wanted to say it's going to be like a Storm Bolter or maybe like, God forbid, a quad bolt rifle, which is just absolutely silly. We don't have to get into that right now. But just looking at the facts I have available to you that we know for certain, that does not trade favorably. And before you say, well, it's not a direct comparison, you know, the Predator tank is for shooting light vehicles, and this is like an anti-infantry weapon, let's compare it to the anti-infantry Predator tank, because we actually have one of those. The Ball Predator, the Blood Angels Predator tank. A tank that was famously used by the Blood Angels as the close support anti-infantry specialist, and that wields a devastating twin assault cannon, which has half the amount of shots. But I hear you crying right now, saying, but wait, it's strength 6. That strength matters. And in the case where you're firing at, say, toughness 3, that's +1 to wound, or firing at toughness 5, that's +1 to wound. But I don't think you need a math degree to know that getting double the amount of shots is better than +1 to wound. And don't even get us started on the Primaris anti-tanks, which are generally better, and we don't even need to go into that, I think. Which brings us back to the key issue here. They are making the same unit as a Predator tank, the same role, the same slot, but it's better. And sure, it'll be like 80 points more expensive, but it won't be double the price. That's what it should be. It'll be the same platform with a weapon system twice as effective. It's a replacement, and they want you to buy it. They have no incentive to making a vehicle that's just a cool new model for something you already own, because people might choose to just play with their same old Predator tanks. I would, if they just updated the Predator tank rules to having a better weapon system. I prefer the tracked variant. I don't want the flying tank. That's just my personal preference. And I'm sure people just buy the new model anyway because it looks good, honestly, and frankly, the new sizing to everything kind of makes sense. But it doesn't help the long-term health of the game, and I don't think that's specifically because it's Space Marines. They can release any new unit, and it generally outperforms all of its comparisons. Even with the new Necron releases, you look at some of the stuff they're adding, and it's all just, you know, well, more damage. The personality of the Necrons have been gutted for just more effective damage on target. A lot of the fun of the Necrons, at least in my personal experience with them, was their unique gadgets. They had Technomancers that could do different jobs and affect various things differently. They had weapons that wounded against initiative and various other fun, unique things that other factions didn't have available to them. And that's the crux. That's what makes them interesting and compelling. Sure, a lot of people are attracted to doing a lot of damage. When you deal damage, you're the superstar. It's about you. It's the power fantasy of playing the Imperial Knights. Everyone loves to sit down, slap their big centerpiece model on the field and say, that's right, look at this, I'm about to kick ass. But that's selfish. What's the point of bringing a giant centerpiece model that your opponent has to play around? It takes the fun away from the other player. And it's these things that cause the damage spikes. Imperial Knights ran the meta for a long time, and people were forced to bring high damage units to kill them. And when certain factions didn't have that available to them, they didn't get played. So they add new stuff that deals more damage to deal with these bigger units that are big centerpiece units that everyone's using, and gets us to this point again. These units are getting countered by high DPS. High DPS will still kill smaller stuff at the same rate. They either need to find a way to make these more killable or more manageable, or make them deal less damage so it's not as punishing for them to be alive on the field. Make it an objective-based game. Killing the enemy is a reward in itself. Killing the enemy means they're going to shoot at you less, and they're not going to control objectives. There really shouldn't be any other bonuses than that. Which is kind of what we're seeing now with a lot more objective-based game modes in 9th edition, but I argue they're not going far enough. It's still too easy to just wipe the field with your enemy. And the sad thing is, when you look at other companies handling this IP, they do the concept a lot better. I'm going to go ahead and drag in the Dawn of War series at this point, the elephant in the room. And for this, I'm going to be looking at Dawn of War 2. I feel like it's the best game in the series to handle the asymmetry of tempos. You're playing an elite and deadly faction. Almost all of your units will trade favorably with almost all of the enemy units, but you'll never outnumber them. No matter what you do, your stuff is more expensive and will be harder to replace than if the enemy trades a couple guardsman squads into you. But that doesn't mean they're unkillable. Sure, there's counter units, but it's still going to be hard to get those counter units into play. Case in point, Banshees. Banshees are an iconic Eldar unit that will absolutely tear a Space Marine squad apart with their power swords. So you don't fight them in melee. Maybe you bring a couple units that can suppress them, or you trade your melee into them while shooting at them. There's ways around them, but they're not the defining feature of the game. They don't do so much damage that you don't have a way of dealing with them, but they're just a factor to be present of. In fact, this represents a point that GW seems to miss a lot, that you can do high damage and have it not be as oppressive as some other units. These units are dangerous. Eldar Guardians in this game will shred Space Marines, but if you get them in the cover and start trading with them, it's a really effective trade. And that's denying the whole point that as a Guardian, you don't even have to fight them on a fair fight. You're faster, you're quicker, and there's going to be more of you than there will be Space Marines. You can simply just play the objective and flank and never fight them on equal ground, which is fun. That's an actual interesting dynamic between the Eldar and the Space Marines. The fact that they're quicker, they're smarter, they're faster, and the chances of catching them in a slugfest is next to nothing, and they shouldn't be trying to slug you out. And that's when you get back to tabletop and realize that those kind of asymmetries rarely happen nowadays. Most weapon systems can reach across the board and tag people from deployment to deployment. It's a slugfest. Everything's a slugfest. So what do you want in a slugfest? Damage, because that's the only thing that matters. In previous editions, weapons had shorter ranges, or the longer range weapons were incredibly immobile. So when you had a fast unit that can get around the battlefield, you were able to dodge fire while controlling the battlefield. And that didn't matter until something with very short range weapons came into play. Eldar units on tabletop, if you don't get the charge, are going to explode, which is kind of a juxtaposition to in the past when you had things like Banshees on tabletop that generally fought first no matter what because of a higher initiative stat. Initiative determined the order of combat and allowed a little bit more granularity between fighting first with this unit or fighting first with this unit based on charging. It's kind of the reason why you see the Space Marine captain with Thunderhammer show up so much. He was never that oppressive of a unit, even despite the fact that Space Marine captains showed up in melee in previous editions, because he could lose to combats he couldn't even fight it. There were faster, stronger units. Hive Tyrants, other monsters, Eldar units all fought before the captain and were generally going to kill him. So you didn't have to worry about every Space Marine taking a super melee unit that will absolutely slaughter everything, and that's just a factor of life now. There was more thought to it. You had to actually plan around what you were fighting. A Blood Angels captain with higher initiative was not as troubled by things like other Space Marine captains because you fought first. However, if you took certain weapons, it reduced your initiative or even increased it in some cases. It adds more granularity, which can only help the game. It's these kinds of asymmetries between two forces that affects the game in a positive way. You need to stop looking at your player base like they're idiots, GW. Most people who play 40k have way more free time than they really care to admit, and can handle the rules. Honestly, I think it's up to the player base at this point. Start house ruling more complex things. You'll find that your enjoyment tends to go up, honestly. It's up to the player base themselves to really bring this kind of back into the positive light. Money will speak much more than any of fucking 30-minute videos I could put out. So it's up to you guys. If you really agree with me, go ahead and start house ruling your own things. Maybe stop buying every new powerhouse unit just because you want to win, although I really don't see that happening anytime soon. A fun game will always get a competitive scene. That's how every major competitive video game has started out. CSGO, that all started with Counter-Strike, which was just a fun mod. StarCraft, that was just a game people enjoyed. No one's creating a game to be competitive and succeeding. Case in point, Heroes of the Storm. That kind of ran into its own face because it tried to be overly competitive. Make it fun, and the competition will follow. Thanks for listening, guys.